What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. I binged watched season 2 of Dark on Netflix yesterday, and I'm very excited to sink my teeth into it. But before diving into any spoilers, I do want to open this video with some general comments about the show because I'm still working on convincing most of my friends and family members, even those who are confirmed media fanatics, that they need to give this show a try. And without giving anything away, Dark is the best story about time travel that I have ever seen on either the big or small screen. Created by the husband-wife filmmaking duo of Baran Bo-Odar and Janti Fries, I hope I'm saying their names correctly, this might be the most complicated story from a structural standpoint that I've ever seen, in that events that take place in the future have massive impact on events in the past, creating paradoxes and time loops that just might make your head explode as you try to make sense of them logically. But what makes this show unforgettable is how the emotions of the story, the sexual tension, the terrible threats the characters are facing, these are always front and center, no matter what mind-shattering sci-fi concepts might be getting explored at any given moment. Some folks call it the German Stranger Things, others call it the German Twin Peaks, and while I hope such praise encourages more people to see the show, I don't think either comparison is accurate. Dark is a unique storytelling experience unlike anything we've ever seen before, and I'm thrilled beyond words that Netflix has already given the go-ahead for the third season, or third cycle as the trailer describes it. In any event, that's all I have to say to the unconverted, so if you haven't watched seasons 1 and 2, go do so now, because I'm about to try and unpack the delicious insanity of season 2. So I've always enjoyed reading giant science fiction and fantasy sagas that require the use of an appendix or a guide in order to navigate the story properly. But Dark is the first TV show I've ever watched where I've had a similar experience. Even after watching season 1 twice, as I binged watched season 2 yesterday, I found myself constantly checking online to confirm details about the characters in terms of their parentage and their relationships and how they're all connected. Because as this show is fond of repeating, the end is the beginning and the beginning is the end. Everything is connected. And to an outside observer, this might sound like a lot of work, but it was quite the opposite. Ordinarily, I hate binging shows. I find it exhausting. And in terms of building an audience for a show, I think a weekly format is much better for a show's long-term health. But binging season 2 of Dark was no problem at all. I was shocked and amazed when the season ended abruptly after only 8 episodes. I thought my Netflix app had screwed up at first and sat up in righteous indignation. I was ready to go 2 more rounds. But on the positive side, that will only make the arrival of the third cycle all the sweeter when Netflix eventually releases it. The big question most fans are going to debate overall is whether or not season 2 is better or worse than season 1. It's a fair question. I'll admit that during the first few episodes of season 2, I worried initially that this season would struggle to recapture the magic of the first season. But then at the end of episode 4, we were treated to an awe-inspiring revelation that felt like a bullet going right through my forehead, and I realized that this show had somehow managed both to sustain and build upon the insanity of the first season and take it to even weirder heights. If you're still with me and you haven't watched the show, don't yell at me. I warned you that I'd be going into specifics, but at the end of episode 4, we learned that the hero and the villain of the show are one and the same person. As it turns out, Jonas is Adam, a monster who's been horribly disfigured as a side effect of 66 years of time travel. Having failed repeatedly to set everything back to normal, now as an embittered, cynical old man, he's decided that he wishes to break the endless cycles and time loops and build a new world, one without God or time, which for him are one and the same thing. Of course, he tricks his younger self into believing that Adam wishes to undo all the horrible things that have happened in Winden, going all the way back to Jonas's father's suicide. But it blows my mind that a story that began as a simple case of a child going missing in a small town has grown into this sprawling sci-fi saga with the fate of the entire world hanging in the balance, and it doesn't seem ridiculous. It feels completely earned in the natural evolution of all that has come before. And as if things weren't complicated enough, with the cliffhanger of season 2, we see that alternate worlds and realities are about to be thrown into the mix as well. So before the end of this story in season 3, I wouldn't be surprised if the fate of the entire universe and all parallel realities will somehow also be at stake. And yet, the show somehow has remained grounded, focusing on the lives of these simple characters living in the small town of Winden. Episode 6 of season 2 was a masterstroke. The show took a breath, slowed down, and let us enjoy the company of all these characters again as they were before all hell broke loose. Jonas travels back to June 20th, 2019, 6 months before the events of season 1, in order to try and save his father's life. Everyone seems heartbreakingly innocent. We see them partying, falling in love, riding bicycles, swimming in the lake. And if not for this wonderfully calm episode to ground the story again, the show very easily could have flown off the rails. This episode also gives us my favorite bootstrap paradox. As we learn in episode 3, a bootstrap paradox is when an item or information is sent back in time, creating a never-ending cycle. As they explain it, the idea or item no longer has any real origin. It exists without ever having been created. Well, in episode 6, our time-traveling Jonas pretends to be his innocent, naive self who lives in the same period. He covers up the scar on his neck, and he sits down to talk with Martha by the lake. And as Martha stares at him with this beautiful intensity, Jonas tells her, "I think we're a perfect match," before they enjoy a big smooch. And it's this moment that sets in motion the evening of lovemaking that for the time-traveling Jonas was so long ago, but for the innocent, naive Jonas is about to take place that night, where the innocent, naive Jonas hears Martha say precisely the same words, "I think we're a perfect match." Seeing this show combine a concept like a bootstrap paradox with an incestuous teen romance is why this show is unlike anything I've ever seen. Also, quick question, is this year the most pro-incest year in television history? We just saw Jon Snow getting it on with his aunt, Daenerys Targaryen, and now we have Jonas willingly pursuing his dad's sister. Consequences be damned. Not to mention the fact that Jonas's mother, Hannah, has made love to both Martha's dad, Ulrich, as well as Martha's brother, Mikkel. So when it comes to pure, raw melodrama, this is a tough combination to beat. But after seeing the season 2 cliffhanger, my question is whether or not the Martha from the other world will fall in love with the Jonas who's just seen the Martha he loves shot dead by Adam. Perhaps the nagging concerns about being in love with your aunt will no longer be relevant. So while offering a complete synopsis of this season and a breakdown of all the characters is totally beyond my fragile powers, I do want to call attention to certain ingredients that I particularly loved. Obviously, the ideological war between Jonas and Adam is the spine of this tale, but there's so much more to enjoy. As more and more characters started learning about time travel, I worried that the show would come unglued, but the show came up with a great solution to consolidate all these characters into one group. As we come to learn, Adam establishes an organization known as the Travelers, whose motto is Sic Mundus Creatus Est, meaning thus the world was created. The villain Noah and his younger self are both very eager disciples, but it appears as if the core group is initially founded by the older, more world-weary Jonas when he saved Magnus, Franziska, and Bartos right before the apocalypse. I love their lair that we see in the year 1921, deep, deep, deep underground, where featured front and center is the painting The Fall of the Damned by Peter Paul Rubens. The painting goes all the way back to 1620, and some asshole threw acid on it in 1959, but the painting famously depicts the bodies of the damned being hurled into the abyss by the Archangel Michael, and throughout the season it becomes a beautiful visual reminder of Adam's apocalyptic vision, and the existence of the Travelers also answered most of my questions from Season 1 as to how the tunnels and the doors beneath the nuclear power plant were created in the first place. What made me laugh about this season is how much I got wrong in my predictions ahead of time. I assumed wrongly that we'd be spending quite a bit of time in the distant future, but as it turns out, we barely spent any time there at all, apart from Jonas's discovery of the God particle and Elizabeth's subsequent attempt to hang him. Also, the story of Elizabeth makes me so sad. In Season 1, she was one of my favorite minor characters, but in the future, she's a scarred ruin of a human being leading a small cult, promising them salvation. And in yet another paradox that'll make your head pop clean off, we learn that she at some point has a child with the villainous Noah. That child is Charlotte, who in her own time gives birth to Elizabeth, meaning that Elizabeth is both the daughter and the mother of Charlotte all at once. When their adult selves finally meet through a portal opened by the God particle or dark matter or Higgs field, whatever you want to call it, their brief moment of contact appears to have been the catalyst that ignites the apocalypse, almost as if a paradox that unusual is more than the world can handle. That's at least my interpretation. Most likely, the apocalypse would have proceeded according to plan, whether they met or not. What's great is how throughout the season, we're constantly reminded of the countdown to the apocalypse in each and every era, giving the season overall a feeling of a ticking clock scenario that's completely, totally independent from any specific year. So as I've mentioned before, the greatest strength of the show is its ability to remain grounded even when conceptually the ambitious writing is aiming for the moon. The attention to little details is so important. In the very first scene of the season, we see the young Noah stabbing a non-believer repeatedly with a pickaxe. It's absolutely gruesome, and we'd have to just sit there and endure each and every poke as Noah stabs the guy over and over again in the back. It was insanely hardcore. And anytime one feels like they're getting lost trying to make sense of the tapestry of all these interwoven plot lines, the show will feature a visceral scene that brings the viewer right back down to earth. We have savage emotional scenes like when Hannah chooses to leave Ulrich stranded in the distant past. Or on the flip side, we have simple, tender shots like that of the aging, scarred Jonas sleeping in his childhood bed, being looked after by his mother after decades apart. The scene where Ulrich, as a very old man, finally gets to be reunited with his son Mikkel, however briefly, nearly brought me to tears. It was a great callback to the very first episode of the very first season when Mikkel was explaining to his dad how his magic trick functions. But this delicate balancing act between highbrow concepts and simple grounded human emotion is what makes me such a fanatic for the show. In a moment that perfectly captures this contrast, we see Franziska shrieking at her parents about keeping secrets, and Franziska chooses to bundle her dad's interest in a transgender hooker right in with his knowledge of time travel, two topics that ordinarily would not be mentioned in the same breath in a typical conflict between a child and her parents, but this is the world of Dark, and these are the concerns that the teenagers are facing. If I had to call attention to any flaws this season, I have two minor gripes. I feel like Noah could have been put to better use because he ended up being completely, totally overshadowed by Adam, whereas in season 1, Noah is absolutely the heart of darkness. Hopefully the presence of his younger self will keep the character in play, in spite of Agnes having shot the older Noah to death. And it seems like when it comes to the violent dark side of things, perhaps this season tapped the brakes just a little bit. There wasn't a single scene in the entire show that captured the nightmarish brutality of when Ulrich tries to kill the child Helga in the very first season. Also, I have to admit that the very last episode didn't quite have the punch and the epic feel of the season 1 finale. These are minor gripes, but I'm perfectly willing to concede that this season is not without its fair share of flaws. But when you compare these flaws to the overall concept and the overall execution, these flaws start to feel like very small drops in a very large bucket. Overall, I remain an incredibly satisfied fan. As a kid, movies like The Terminator and Back to the Future used to represent the high watermark of time-traveling adventure, and while I still love those movies for many reasons, clearly the new heavyweight champion of time-traveling shenanigans is Dark. My only hope is that between cycles 2 and 3, this show picks up the massive audience it deserves. Also, when it comes to building the audience, I had a really fun, unique privilege a couple weeks back where I got invited to participate in this video for Netflix's German YouTube channel. And in the video, they compare and contrast 3 superfans for the show, one in Tokyo, one in Buenos Aires, and one in New York, yours truly. But I just had an absolute blast working with that crew, so I'll include a link to that video in the video notes below. In any event, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this video up. As you can tell from the tone of my voice, I absolutely loved and adored this show. I wish more people were watching it. It deserves to have a much bigger cultural impact than it is currently enjoying. But if any of you out there want to talk about dark or science fiction or Netflix or whatever, you can always find me on Twitter @Colbrax or leave me a comment in the comments below. Also, please consider giving this video a like and this channel a subscribe. That's very helpful to me. But hope everyone has an amazing weekend. Hope everyone enjoys the show. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.